Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Peacecraft. Um, so in this episode, I really want to speak with you all about theater, the theater of life, and how important this perspective is in peacecraft, peacemaking, bringing forth justice. Now, we've all watched movies. I hope many people have also watched plays, um, or musicals, or even read a fable, or a novel, or even a short story. This is a theater that we're living in at this moment. Much of art, much of fiction, is based upon our actual lives. That's where all these creative stories come from. So when we look at things, like for instance, when we look at Ukraine, we have to see it as a theater, okay? In a sense that there's all these different actors all on this stage. It's called the world or the planet. And we're not in the audience, actually. How this is all built is much like what Shakespeare is very well quoted. The world is a stage. The world is a stage. There are no orchestra pits. There are no um, auditorium seats. Okay? We're all on stage. So, what does this mean? This means that peacemaking can be done by all players. We're all on stage. And this is highly prevalent. We can see in Russia there have been um, many, many people being arrested, even fleeing because they don't agree with the war. They're anti-war. Um, bear in mind, you know, women, children, teachers, uh, even craftspeople. Uh, you know, they left the country of Russia. Um, they weren't all into the theater of that's kind of what's happening that Putin started, and that's like, and I'm using that term theater here in the sense of we often have a narrow view of it. We often have the narrow view of a theater between countries in a war. I'm showing and telling you, and even deeply sharing with you, that this theater includes us. Peace movements, justice movements, is a great example of how we are all a part of the theater. Solidarity movements, civil rights movements, even social justice movements. One of my favorites is the one that happened in South Africa to end apartheid. These are all moments where, in a sense, the fourth wall was broken, in a sense. Normally, we have major figures versus a major figure, or we have one organization, another organization, so on and so forth. But when we really pay attention, everyone is on stage. People do have agency. And that's the one thing I believe uh, can be quite dangerous in a sense, especially for those who are too concerned with power. They have this greed and lust for it. A good example is Putin, getting back to Ukraine. Now, there are many who see what's happening right now between Ukraine and Russia as a return, in a sense, for the USSR and its territories and so on and so forth. And that's not the full picture, you know? The theater is much bigger than that. Now, remember, when we look at stories, we have to look at histories, okay? For instance, when we pick up, let's say, a Harry Potter book, and we start reading the first book of Harry Potter, throughout the story, we learn more and more about the characters. Peter, Hermione, not only about their development, but even like how their history affects them in their development along with their relationships, right? And that's the same type of mode we should be in when we're dealing with um, conflicts that arise. So, here's a thing for us to really think about. I have some questions for you. When we're looking at conflicts, we also need to look at histories. So, how is Ukraine and Russia tied in their history? Okay. And then further, we need to see it in different time frames. We need to look at way back in the feudal times, for instance. And then we get into the time of the Russian Empire and the Tsars and so on and so forth. And then soon after that fell, then the USSR came and so on and so forth. So we need to look at through that whole history, okay? And I think it's very much important too. We need to ask, why does Putin and Russia want to reclaim Ukraine? Okay? We need to understand narrative, and that's something that's deeply a part of the perspective of theater. We need to look at narratives, okay? Um, Narratives don't have to be at all truthful, ethical, and so on and so forth. Um, what's much more important is we ask, what are the desired outcomes of those narratives? Because narratives are often attached with certain visions, okay? And that's what we need to look at. Where does Russia want to bring this story? You know, that's what we're dealing with in the aspect and the perspective of theater. There is a story being written every second of humanity, and we're all a part of that. All our stories are part of one story. Okay. Um, and we may think that we're all innocent spectators to another, but we're not just spectators. We're all actors. We're all players in all this. Um, yeah, indirectly directly or indirectly. Now returning back to the story visions. The same goes for what's happening on the other player, Ukraine. What is Ukraine's vision, of the future? And that's where conflicts often happen. Conflict often happens is when there's uh, incompatible, okay, incompatible desires and visions and so on and so forth. Um, it's a certain clash that kind of happens. So yeah, it needs to be addressed. One of the major uh, missed opportunities is the inability to look through the other person's eyes and to really begin to understand their position. Okay? That is why it's very important to have the perspective of theater. If we're unable to look at this conflict from multiple point of views, peace will be nothing more than a pipe dream. Um, because Peacecraft, it's a craft, it's a work. One of my great inspirations, Johann Galtung, he calls it conflict work, conflict workers. It's a certain work that needs to be done to kind of bridge these two realities into one instead of having them clash. Okay. And in order for you to do that, you need to enter into one reality as well as the other. And you need to see where the discrepancies are, where there is a bit of honesty, you know? Uh, we're all human here. There are things, instances within our life that deeply affect us, okay? We have certain experiences, not only just immediately personally, but there's also generationally as well within our collective histories. Um, I mean, just look at America, for instance, right? The history of the European settler, right? It's very different from the history of the indigenous peoples of America, as well as the Africans and even the Asians that have immigrated to America. And these are all significant um, things to consider. This is part of the complexity of the theater, of the story. In order for us to understand the story in theater today as we are experiencing it, we need to understand the past. And not just the past in a whole, but like the intersectionality of all these histories together and how they're all intertwined. And then we need to also look forward. Because remember, craft and theater, they lead on to a certain climax, to a conclusion. The story continues on. Okay? So we need to look into what are the visions. What do these persons, peoples, what do they want? What do they need? You know? Um it's very important we ask this. And it's something that storytellers uh understand, and we also need to understand as well. Not only to understand the world that we live in, but even deeper understand our own personal world, in a sense, our own lives, and how we relate. I remember, this is a personal story. Um, I went to uh, visit a mutual friend, and we had this conversation about life and so on and so forth. And question circled around the room about whether or not you know we are the main character, you know, of life and so on and so forth. And personally, we are not. I don't believe there is a main character. There's only characters at play, in a sense. I don't think there is a main character. Um, uh, Thing is, there are more prevalent, impactful characters that come along, but there's no main character. Um, I find it very self-centered and a slippery slope. Um, and I think that's what often causes conflict. What causes a lot of conflict in a theatrical perspective is we see ourselves as the main character, and we see um, supporting characters, adversaries, etc., etc. Um, when actually, okay, what's going on is that I am a character of the story of humanity. I interact with other characters. Certain characters, certain conflicts will happen. Certain characters be highly beneficial in my own story. Okay? The thing is, my own story is not the story. My story, your story, is in a sense a. How's a way to put this? If we were to see the whole story of humanity as an organism, our stories are just like a cell of it. We are part of the evolution of humanity as we speak. And this brings a lot of responsibility. And that is another important facet of taking the theatrical perspective as well as acting upon it. Okay? Is that this brings about the notion that we are responsible. We are not spectators. There is no audience. The world is a stage. We're all actors. We are responsible. Of course, there's uh, levels to this. There's a gradient to all this, like how responsible you are, but there's still responsibility. You know, um, and so to wrap things up, that is the most important thing for us in Peacecraft is a tool of taking the theatrical perspective. Okay, we need to see all the players. We need to look at how they're interacting, why they're interacting this way, looking at each history and finding the intersections between them all. We need to look at all the motives, understand why they have those motives. What are their fears? What are their wants? These are all things that we all need to consider in the story. Okay? And so, yeah, I'll leave it to you. This has been a beautiful time with you. Um, yeah, Feel free to contact me if you have any questions, if you want me to go deeper into this. I love questions. It really helps the conversation. I'm much of a more of a dialogic person. Um, so yeah, send them over if you have any. Other than that, I will check in with you again